Part 2. During. Battle stations. "It's a trick," said Stanley. "A prank. It has to be." This time, I wasn't the only one rooted to the spot with fear. Both Stanley and I stood staring in horror as 3 more Japanese planes swooped down in a V formation, headed right for the Utah. Right for me and Stanley. The planes flew impossibly low, almost like they were coming in for a landing, then leveled out at the last second. I watched with wonder as one of them peeled off to our right, toward the USS Raleigh. And then all 3 planes dropped long, finned cylinders in the water. "Fish!" the sailor with the funny papers cried out, backing away from the rail. Brooks rushed over, grabbing me and Stanley and dragging us away. "Run!" he yelled. I looked back over my shoulder. 3 V-shaped wakes were streaking toward us underwater, and I understood what the sailor meant by fish. Torpedoes. The planes that had dropped the torpedoes roared overhead, just barely missing the antennas on the conning tower, and making us all duck. And then, thoom. The ship lurched. The Utah rose and fell. A 30,000-ton battleship knocked about like it was a toy boat. Water shot into the air and cascaded over the rail. My legs buckled, and I threw my arms out to keep from falling to the deck. Stanley fell, and so did Brooks. I helped them both up in time for the second torpedo to hit. Thoom. And this time, all 3 of us went crashing down onto the deck. I heard the shriek of rending metal and the screams of injured men. And then, slowly and steadily, the Utah began tilting toward the harbor. "The torpedoes must have blown holes in the side of the ship," Brooks yelled. "We're taking on water. The Utah is sinking." My heart caught in my throat. This couldn't be happening. I just had been thinking about how sturdy the Utah was, how safe, how invincible. 2 torpedoes later, all that was out the window. Brooks was pulling Stanley and me to our feet when a sailor with his face half covered in shaving cream climbed out of a nearby hatch. "What in the Sam Hill is going on?" he asked. "I think we're at war with the Japanese," said Brooks. With a shock, I realized Brooks was right. We hadn't been at war with Japan, but we had to be now. Only, how were Japanese planes attacking Pearl Harbor when we were 4,000 miles away from Japan? The other sailor blinked in surprise. "Well, if it really is them, this is the beginning of the end of the Japanese Empire." Right now, it looked like the end of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. I stood on the swiftly tilting deck and watched, mesmerized, as suddenly there were hundreds of Japanese planes in the sky, flying figure eights and swooping down to bomb and shoot. And no one was shooting back. Water spouts erupted all over the harbor, and black smoke rose from Battleship Row, from the submarine base across the bay, from 1010 Dock and the airfields on the mainland, from the other side of Ford Island. My heart stopped. Ford Island? Mom, Ginny, Dad. I left them at home that morning making pancakes and listening to ukulele music on the radio. Now bombs were falling right on top of them. Had our house been hit? Did they have any warning? Were they all right, or were they... Stanley turned on me, wild-eyed, and grabbing my arm so hard it hurt. He must have been thinking the same thing about his family. "Frank," he yelled, "we gotta get off this ship. We gotta get home." "We're not going anywhere right now," Brooks told us. "Take cover." He pointed us to one of the big stacks of timbers on the deck. "I've got to get to my station, but I'll be back." I nodded, but my legs didn't seem to get the message. I stood frozen as the big, once empty deck filled with sailors coming from up below. Some of them were in their Sunday uniforms, but others wore only white shorts or pants. One sailor stretched and yawned in bright red pajamas. They all blinked in the sunlight, trying to figure out what was going on. A Japanese plane buzzed down low and unloaded on the deck with tracer fire. Shoom, 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 shoom. I cowered as bullets pinged all around me, throwing hot sparks that burned my skin. The half-shaved sailor did a jerky dance and fell backward into the hatch. I gasped. Was he dead? Was I going to die? A voice inside me was screaming to run, to duck, to hide. But I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was all too much. This was every one of my nightmares come true all at once. "Frank, get down!" Stanley cried, pulling me with him behind a big stack of wood. I threw my hands over my head as bullets struck the bullhead around us and chewed up the timbers. I remembered Brooks joking about the target practice drills, complaining that the only people who ever shot at him were U.S. planes. I bet he wished he could take that back now. Brooks. Where was Brooks? Was he okay? I looked around, but he was long gone. "All hands to battle stations!" somebody cried. A bugle call repeated the command more loudly, and I ducked as another explosion boomed somewhere nearby. Another plane roared overhead, and I recognized it from my plane spotter's guide at home. It was a Japanese fighter plane called a Zero. I learned the name and the plane's silhouette, but I never thought I'd actually see one. The sounds of battle around us got louder and louder, like somebody was turning up the volume knob on a radio. I put my hands over my ears and tried to make myself small. Everybody said this was impossible. Pearl Harbor was a fortress. Battleship Row was the Justice Society of America. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was there to protect Hawaii, to protect me. But right now, it couldn't even protect itself. And did nobody else remember the Utah was sinking? "We gotta look for an opening. Get off the ship," Stanley said, peeking around the side of the timbers. Bullets chipped paint from something metal behind us, and Stanley ducked back down. Looking for an opening? Had Stanley lost his mind? If we set one toe out from behind those timbers, we would end up like half-shaved sailor. Other sailors ran here and there on deck as bullets whizzed by and bombs exploded in the water all around us. My pants were drenched, and I wasn't entirely sure whether it was from the geysers or from me peeing myself. A young, pale sailor wandered by, looking as shell-shocked as I felt. He stopped just beyond the stack of timbers where we were hiding, staring out at the planes and the burning ships like he wasn't in the middle of a firestorm. "Hey, mister!" I yelled, my voice croaking. My throat was dry as a bone, and I swallowed hard and tried again. "Hey, mister! Get down or you're gonna get killed!" It was like the sailor didn't hear me. He stood still, muttering something under his breath as bullets tore up the deck all around him. Stanley and I looked at each other. This guy was toast if he didn't get a move on. I thought about going out to grab him, but what if a stray bullet hit me? What if I slipped on the wet deck and tumbled over the side? What if... But before I could think of another what if, Stanley jumped up and ran for the sailor. 3 hots and a cot. Stanley grabbed the sailor's shirt tail and dragged him down behind the timbers with us right as chum 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 chum. Bullets pounded the bulkhead behind us, and another Japanese Zero zoomed overhead and disappeared into the smoke. I blinked at Stanley and the sailor huddled beside me. They were both okay. They hadn't been hit. But the sailor would have been if Stanley hadn't been there. If it had been only me, the sailor would have been chewed up by tracer fire while I crouched frozen with fear. It was Stanley and the bullies all over again. Only this time, it had been life and death. "Hey, you okay?" Stanley asked the sailor. Sailor shook his head slowly. His eyes seemed to be on something 2,000 miles away in California. He muttered words I couldn't understand. "What's he saying?" Stanley asked. I leaned in close and listened. "He's saying, 3 hots and a cot," I said. 3 hots and a cot. 3 hots and a cot. Over and over again. "What is that?" Stanley asked him. "What does that mean?" The question seemed to break the sailor's trance. "It's why I joined the Navy," he said. "I grew up poor, and the Navy promised me 3 hot meals and a cot to sleep on. Not this. Never this." Stanley and I looked at each other across the sailor. Our dads hadn't joined the Navy because they were poor. They joined because they wanted careers in the Navy. How many other guys here at Pearl were like this sailor, though? Just here because they needed a job, and Uncle Sam was paying. The ship lurched hard, and the 3 of us were jerked backward against the stack of wood. The timbers creaked and shifted, and I worried about being crushed by them. But where else were we supposed to go? "What was that?" Stanley asked. "Another torpedo?" The sailor blinked and looked up. "No, it's the hawsers," he said. I suddenly understood. The ships parked around Ford Island were tied to concrete pillars with big, thick ropes called hawsers. Usually those ropes hung loose as the ships drifted gently in the still water of the harbor. But now that the Utah was tilting, its hawsers had stretched taut, jarring us as they caught. The mooring ropes would keep us from capsizing, as long as they didn't snap, which would be really, really bad. When ropes that big snapped and whipped around, they could cut a person in half. I held my breath and waited. The Utah groaned and strained underneath us. The stacked timbers shifted and squeaked. The smokestack and conning tower high above us tilted at a dangerous, unnatural angle. But the ropes held. The ship wasn't going to flip. I breathed a big sigh of relief. "Why aren't we shooting back?" Stanley asked, craning his neck. Japanese Zeros kept shooting and dropping torpedoes and bombs, but so far, we hadn't heard the familiar sound of American artillery. "The anti-aircraft guns are covered up from our target practice," the pale-faced sailor told us. "It takes a crane to get those things off." Of course. The big wooden shrouds we'd seen when we first came on board. All the Utah's guns were covered to protect them from practice bombs. I peeked out at the deck and saw 3 white sailors and 2 black sailors trying to lift the protective box off of one of the guns, but it was too heavy. I did a double take. Every ship had black sailors, but they were support staff, cooks and stewards and laundry attendants, things like that. I knew that these black sailors were not trained for combat and not expected to be on deck in the middle of a fight. But here a couple of them were, trying to help their ship's guns firing back. They didn't have to put themselves in harm's way, but they were doing just that. "What I want to know is, where are all our planes?" the sailor next to us asked. Stanley and I looked at each other in horror, both of us clearly thinking about our dads. It would have taken my dad and Mr. Summers only a few minutes to run from our houses to the airfield. Mr. Summers and his crew would have gotten a Warhawk prepped and ready in no time, and Dad would have been in the air by now, hunting Zeros. Unless they'd both been killed right away when the bombs fell on Nob Hill. "We gotta get home," Stanley said, and I nodded, too scared to speak. Before either of us could move, there was a sound like a giant whip cracking. Whoopsh! A stack of timbers on the other side of the deck exploded like a bomb had hit them. But there was no fire, no smoke. There was another whip crack sound and screams, and the Utah lurched and started tilting even faster than before. Oh no. The hawsers had snapped. The Utah was capsizing. "Abandon ship!" somebody cried. "Abandon ship!" Full tilt. I stayed frozen in a crouch, watching as sailors in all states of dress appeared out of nowhere, running and sliding down the deck. The Utah's bugler repeated the signal to abandon ship. "Come on!" cried the sailor Stanley had rescued. He sprinted out from behind the stack of timbers and tumbled down the tilting deck toward the rail. Stanley stood to follow him. I was building up the courage to do the same when Brooks appeared. His white baseball uniform was ripped and smudged with grease and blood. "No, don't jump off that way," Brooks told Stanley. "If you don't swim fast enough, the ship will roll over onto you." My eyes went wide. How had I not thought of that? Usually, I was the first to imagine the worst thing that could happen, but my brain wasn't working right now. All the bombs, the bullets, the screeching of the ship, and the screaming of the sailors, they made my thoughts a traffic jam, like when everybody got in their cars to leave the base at 5 o'clock every afternoon. Total gridlock. "We have to climb up the deck and jump off the starboard side," Brooks yelled. I looked at where Brooks was pointing. The deck was tilted at an almost 45-degree angle. To get to the starboard rail, we would have to climb the deck like hiking up a hill. I flinched as another Japanese Zero buzzed by, shooting at something I couldn't see. The thick, dark smoke had suddenly turned morning into night. Brooks and Stanley were already scrambling up the tilting deck. I knew I should follow them. I knew the Utah was capsizing, with me in it. But I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I stayed right where I was, huddled and shaking behind the groaning, shifting stack of timbers. Brooks must have expected me to be right behind him, because he was halfway to the other side of the deck when he looked back and cursed. He signaled for Stanley to keep going without him, and clambered back down to where I was frozen. Brooks shook me and said something, but words had lost all meaning. I stared at him like he was an alien in a comic book, his word bubble written in an alphabet I didn't understand. A stack of timbers on the other side of the ship broke loose and came thundering down the deck, taking screaming sailors with it. Brooks and I ducked as the planks crashed past us, followed by anything else that wasn't tied down. The landslide of debris clipped the pile of wood we were hiding behind and knocked it loose too. The lumber tumbled down the deck and tore through the flimsy railing, crashing down on all the fleeing sailors who hadn't swum far enough away. Brooks and I turned to look at each other in stunned silence. It was a miracle we hadn't been swept away, and we both knew we wouldn't be so lucky next time. Brooks grabbed me by the arm and pulled. I had to follow him on hands and knees. The Utah was turning over quickly, faster than I ever could have imagined a ship could roll. The 45-degree hill we'd had to ascend a few seconds ago had turned into a 60-degree mountain. We used vent pipes and hatch cleats as handholds, helping each other along like rock climbers. I moved on autopilot. Once frozen into inaction, I now climbed because Brooks had started me climbing. I would have kept going all the way to the top of Mount Kia if he'd pointed me in the right direction. Chum chum chum, chum chum. The wooden deck all around us exploded in a typhoon of bullets and splinters. I tried, hopelessly, to get small. The attacking Zero zoomed by overhead, and Brooks made a rude gesture at it. "Brooks," I said, "I hope you marry my sister." Brooks laughed once. "Me too, kid," he said, "and when we get out of this, I promise I won't waste any time in asking her. But right now, we have to climb." We were climbing almost straight up by then. Farther amidships, one of the cranes attached to the deck went crashing down with a howl of wrenching steel and screams. The conning tower groaned and bent. Boom boats came loose from their stations and spilled down the deck, landing smashed and broken in the water below. Everywhere I turned, there was something that could hurt me. Stanley was waiting for us at the top. He reached down to help Brooks, and Brooks pulled me up with him. I grabbed onto one of the ropes on the starboard rail, happy to cling to it and never move again for the rest of my life. But the ship was still turning over. "We have to keep going over the side," Brooks said. "Yeah, that's going to be a problem," Stanley said. "Look." I peered over the rail, but I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The Utah had listed so far that we wouldn't be jumping into the water. We'd be hitting the side of the ship that was usually under the water. "We'll have to slide down the ship's belly as it rolls over," Brooks told us. Wait, the Utah was turning on its side, yes, but roll all the way over? Brooks was bonkers. The Utah was the size of an apartment building. It couldn't flip upside down. Could it? The conning tower and the smokestack hit the water with a crash that made the entire ship shudder, and the superstructure with the bridge and control top started to sink. It was happening whether I could believe it or not. The Utah was going belly up. "Go, go," Brooks said, pushing Stanley and then me underneath the rail and onto the side of the sinking battleship. Sentinels of Liberty. The side of the Utah wasn't as steep as the deck had been, but Stanley and I slipped and slid down the wet, slimy hull on our behinds. The battle still raged around us, overwhelming my thoughts, but I was more alert now, less in freeze mode and more in flee mode. I didn't need Brooks or Stanley telling me to move. I had to get home. I had to find my parents and Ginny. I looked back over my shoulder and saw Brooks following us over the side, but then he was quickly lost in the smoke. Another Zero burst from the darkness, machine guns blazing, and Stanley and I curled up into balls as bullets pinged around us. When the planes disappeared, Stanley and I got back up fast and kept scooting toward the water. "What madness is this?" Stanley said. He was trying to use his comic book voice, but it came out strained. "Why are our two plucky heroes cutting up their butts on the bottom of a battle wagon as Japanese planes wreak havoc on the American Armada?" It was madness. What were Stanley and I doing here? Not just visiting the Utah, but living on Ford Island, living in Hawaii. Why weren't we safe back in the real mainland, in the United States, far away from all this danger? "Frank, wait," Stanley said, stopping mid-scoot on the hull. "What? No," I cried. What was he doing? He's going to get us killed. "Stanley, we have to keep going." "No, listen," Stanley said, putting his ear to the hull. "I hear something." I blinked and put my ear to the slimy hull. I could barely hear it over the roar of the Zeros and the rat-tat-tat of machine gun fire. But Stanley was right. There was something there, something small and metallic sounding, clanging on the side of the hull right underneath us. Donk, 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 donk. I grabbed Stanley's arm. "It's Morse code, like from our Sentinel of Liberty kit." We'd both mailed in application forms from our Captain America comics to join the Sentinels of Liberty, the greatest army of red-blooded young patriots ever assembled under one flag. For 10 cents each, we'd received a metal badge and an official membership card. On the back of the card were the dots and dashes of the Morse code alphabet, which we had dutifully learned and practiced. We listened again. Tonk, tonk, tonk. Tonk, tonk, tonk. Tonk, tonk, tonk. "That's SOS!" we cried in unison. I rapped on the hull with my knuckles, not in Morse code, but randomly, just to see if anyone responded. Almost immediately, more tonking ran through the metal wall, frantic and urgent. "There are sailors trapped inside the ship," I said. "We gotta help," said Stanley. He looked around desperately, but there were no windows or doors or hatches, just solid metal. This part of the Utah was normally underwater. "Where's Brooks?" I cried. I searched for him in the smoke and chaos, but couldn't see him. The frenzied tapping from inside continued, and Stanley and I looked at each other helplessly. We would need the strength of Captain America himself to get through that hull. "Stanley, we have to leave them," I said sadly. "No, there has to be something," Stanley said. An explosion threw the tower of water into the air that splashed down and drenched us. I grabbed Stanley by the shirt and pulled. "We have to go," I told him. "There's nothing else we can do." Stanley finally relented and let me drag him away. As we scooted the rest of the way down the hull, I tried not to think about the men trapped inside the Utah, which of course meant that all I thought about was the men trapped inside the Utah. Had they closed an interior hatch to get away from the rising water and sealed themselves in with only that air to breathe? Or was the water rising even now in their compartment as the ship continued to founder? I imagined the sheer terror of being in a tiny room as water flooded in, treading water as the air got thinner. The walls, the water, closing in. Nowhere to go, no air to breathe, grasping for a screwdriver, a wrench, anything, and banging desperately on the hull in the hope that someone might hear them. And then a response. 2 boys sliding down the hull outside, hearing and knocking back. And then nothing. They're gone again, and the water is rising, and the hull's getting closer, and no one is coming to save me. "Frank!" Stanley cried. "Frank, jump!" I blinked, coming out of my spiraling thoughts like being awakened from a deep sleep. I was outside the Utah, not trapped inside it, and we'd reached the water, at last. Stanley stood to jump into the harbor when suddenly the Utah shuddered. There was a sickening, gut-shaking crunch, and Stanley fell gracelessly into the water, arms and legs flailing. I held on as the Utah shifted, groaned, and finally settled, belly up. As impossible as it was, the Utah had officially sunk. "Come on!" Stanley called from the water, and I jumped. The power of Prometheus. It was never too cold to swim in Hawaii, even in December, but the sudden dip took my breath away. I hung there for a moment underwater, savoring the peace and quiet while I tried to get my bearings. It was dark from the clouds and smoke above, and there was a gauzy film in the water I guess was fuel or oil from the ruptured Utah. The legs of sailors treaded water nearby. As I watched, bullets shooped around them, leaving diagonal air trails. One of the sailors in the path of the bullets stopped kicking and went still, and I realized being underwater wasn't as peaceful and quiet as I had thought. I came up quickly and swam to Stanley. The sharp smell of burning gasoline and metal filled my nose, and I struggled not to swallow the oily water. "Another beautiful day in paradise," Stanley said grimly. "Do you see Brooks anywhere?" I asked. Stanley shook his head. Neither of us had seen him since we'd gone over the rail. "He'd want us to get home," I said. Zeros droned overhead, and deep, quivering explosions echoed through the water, shaking me inside and out. We couldn't stay here for long. "Look," said Stanley. A motor launch, like the one we'd taken to Utah earlier that morning, zoomed out of the smog and cut its engine in the middle of the stranded sailors. A rescue party. I was so relieved I wanted to cry. Stanley and I swam for the boat with the rest of the sailors, and the coxswain helped fish men out of the water with a boat hook. A sailor I recognized from the Utah pulled me and then Stanley up into the launch. "Where the devil did the Germans come from?" the sailor said, gasping for breath. "It's not the Germans, it's the Japanese," said Stanley. "I can't swim! I can't swim!" a sailor cried from the water, and our rescuer hurried to the other side of the launch to help him. A sailor who couldn't swim? I shook my head. I couldn't imagine I was going to serve on a ship and not learn how to swim first. A bee flew past my ear, and then another, and I swatted at the air. How were there bees out here, on a boat in the middle of a battle? A sailor fell on me and Stanley, pressing us onto the floor of the boat, and tracer fire zipped in the wood where we had been sitting. It wasn't bees, I realized in panic. It was bullets, flying so close I could hear them go by. "We have to get out of here," I yelled. "Where to?" yelled the coxswain. Our launch was full, and another boat had arrived and was pulling our Utahs from out of the water. "Let's get these kids somewhere safe," said the sailor who'd helped us on board, gesturing to me and Stanley. "We'll drop them off on Ford," the coxswain said, and I felt a rush of relief. Home, at last. "Wait, there are sailors still trapped in the Utah," Stanley cried. "Oh, he's right," I said. "We heard them tapping." The coxswain killed the engine, and the downtrodden Utahs suddenly came to life. "Where? When?" they all wanted to know, and Stanley and I did our best to explain. "But that's behind a couple of inches of steel plates," one of the sailors said. "How did we get them out of there?" "If the Human Torch was here, you could just point a finger at it and slice right through the steel with a stream of flames," Stanley said. I cringed at Stanley bringing up a comic book character at a time like this, but his words seemed to strike a chord with the sailor who was wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit. "The kid's onto something," he said. "We could run to the rally, grab an acetone torch, and come back out and cut him right out." I could see the neighboring rally through the smoke. The cruiser was still afloat, but she had clearly taken a hit from a torpedo and was listing mightily. I couldn't believe these sailors were planning to climb on board another capsizing boat, even just to pick up some welding equipment. But the mechanic's suggestion was followed by shouts of agreement. "I'll take these kids to Ford's first," the coxswain said, nodding at me and Stanley. "There's no time," I said, my heart racing as I imagined again that I was trapped inside the Utah with the water rising. I couldn't let those men die like that. Not because their crewmates took extra time getting Stanley and me home. "We'll swim for it," I said. Stanley looked at me with wide-eyed disbelief, and I blinked, startled by my own words. Had I really just suggested that we climb back into the water with all those Japanese Zeros still shooting at us? I opened my mouth to take back what I'd said, but Stanley was already nodding. "It's not far," he said. "We'll be all right. Go, go," he told the sailors. Before the Utahs could object, Stanley was climbing back into the water, and Hawkman helped me. I followed him. The coxswain restarted the engine, and the sailors saluted us as they tore away for the rally. "Off they go, meddlesome mariners, to harness the power of Prometheus and save their confined companions," Stanley cried. And I smiled. For a brief moment, I felt good. Better than good. Somebody was going to rescue those sailors trapped in the Utah. And it was all because of Stanley and me. Now, we just had to swim all by ourselves across open water, dodging bullets and bombs and burning fuel and... Oh no. "Frank, look," Stanley said. The quiet urgency of his voice made me expect something awful as I turned. A shark, maybe, or a giant eel. Everyone always forgot about the giant eels. But it was worse than that, worse than everything else. Floating nearby in the water, face down and lifeless, was a sailor dressed in the white uniform of the Utah's baseball team. The body in the water. Stanley and I had to keep moving. We had to get to Ford Island to see our families were all right. But we couldn't. Not yet. Not until we knew if the body in the water was Brooks. Without a word, we both swam to the body. A Zero shot by overhead, and Stanley and I ducked as a bomb exploded next to the rally, sluicing its deck with seawater. We swam on. Stanley and I got to the sailor at last and turned him over. When I saw who it was, when I saw his face, saw the bullet hole in his chest, I shook my head and backed away. I sobbed once and put a hand to my mouth, trying not to be sick. The body in the water was Brooks Leonard. Brooks Leonard was dead. It didn't make sense. When did it happen? Where had he been when he was shot? It was just 3 minutes ago that I'd seen him alive, held his hand as he pulled me up the tilting deck. Talked to him about Ginny. Ginny. Suddenly all I could think of was my sister and the way she talked about Brooks. The way she looked at him when he wasn't looking. The way she held his arm in both of hers when they walked together. He was going to ask her to marry him. How could I tell Ginny that Brooks was dead? And worse, "This is my fault," I said out loud. Stanley turned to me, looking as sick as I felt. "What?" he said. "You didn't kill Brooks. The Japanese Air Force did." Right at that moment, the Japanese Air Force dropped another torpedo. It missed the ship it was aiming for and hit Ford Island, sending dirt and trees and sand flying. Another Japanese plane came streaking down the line of ships on Carrier Row, blasting them with a machine gun fire, and Stanley and I ducked. We had to go. We had to leave Brooks behind. There was nothing we could do for him now anyway. "We have to swim to Ford underwater," I told Stanley. "It's the safest way." I kicked higher and took a huge breath. "Wait," said Stanley, but I was already diving deep, deep down. I turned to make sure Stanley was all right, and I saw him dunk underwater, cheeks puffed out from the breath he was holding. Behind him, Brooks's body turned on its side, his dead eyes staring at me accusingly. I turned and swam away as hard and fast as I could. Underwater. The battle was strangely muted under the water. Bullets hit all around me with the same little shoomp that my dad's car keys made when he threw them into the deep end of the pool for me to dive after. Bombs hitting the ships sounded like somebody whacking the side of a metal tub full of water. I could feel them, too, the shock waves wobbling the water. Toom. Ahead of me, another sailor's body hung lifelessly under the surface. I wondered if he was somebody else Stanley and I knew, but I couldn't stop to check. Couldn't add another dead friend to my tally. Stanley didn't understand, but I did. I had killed Brooks Leonard as sure as if I'd been flying that Japanese plane. Brooks had died because I'd frozen up behind that stack of wood. If he hadn't had to come back for me, if he hadn't taken all that time to guide me up the tilting deck, he and Stanley and I would have been over the side a lot sooner, and Brooks wouldn't have been wherever he was when that Japanese plane shot a bullet right at that spot. Right place, right time. Brooks had said those words when he'd greeted me and Stanley that morning. But because of me, Brooks had been at the wrong place, at the wrong time. My fear of getting hurt had killed Brooks Leonard. Something moved off to my side, but when I turned to look, it was gone. My heart clenched as I imagined a great white shark swimming out of the dark, oily waters, its huge mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. Toom! Another explosion shook the water, and I realized that the sharks in Pearl Harbor were probably doing the same thing I was, trying to get the heck out of there. They would be back soon, especially with all these bodies in the water. But if they were smart, they were already long gone, out into the open sea. I hoped somebody got Brooks's body out of the water before the sharks returned. Ford Island was close, but it seemed like forever until I was finally pulling myself up, drenched, out of the water. The beach was rough and steep here, and I cut myself up scrambling out. A few scrapes were the least of my worries, though. When I turned to help Stanley out of the water, he wasn't there. The Submariner. "Stanley!" I yelled. "Stanley!" He'd been right behind me. Straight away, I pictured 1,000 things that might have happened to him. A stray bullet, a bomb, maybe he got entangled up in a loose hawser, or drowned, or been eaten by a fleeing shark, or... Suddenly, Stanley burst up through the surface, gasping for breath, but he was still yards away from shore. "Stanley!" I shouted. "Are you all right?" He nodded wearily, gulped down another lungful of air, and disappeared under the water. What was taking him so long? I had crouched by the shore as Japanese planes circled like vultures and blasts echoed from every direction. I felt the old urge to run, hide, but I couldn't leave without Stanley. I cowered as a piece of twisted metal came whistling across the harbor, chewing up the water like a saw blade. Had it hit Stanley? Was he swimming deep enough? I remembered the dead body I'd seen floating underwater. If Stanley was hit, would I even know he was dead? Stanley burst from the water right in front of me, gasping for breath like a fish, and I cried out in surprise. A second later, I had my wits about me and was stumbling over to grab him. "How did you swim so far underwater, so fast, without coming up for air?" Stanley asked me as I helped him up to the beach. "I came up for air like 3 times. I blinked at that. Had Stanley really not been able to hold his breath the whole time? He'd been behind me, so I hadn't noticed. "It's like you can breathe underwater," Stanley said. "Are you the son of a sea captain and an Atlantean princess or something?" I smiled at that, but I couldn't tell Stanley the real reason I was so good at swimming, not without telling him everything, and there was no time for that now. I glanced over at Carrier Row. The black smoke and swirling orange flames were thick, but I could see that American ships were finally firing back. Anti-aircraft guns on the Tangier and the Detroit were working non-stop. The Rally's crews were firing too, even though their ship had sunk straight down to the harbor floor and the gunners were now standing in 1 foot of water. None of the shooting seemed to be doing much good, though. When the American gunners aimed straight up, the black plumes from their exploding shells fell short of the high-altitude Japanese bombers. When the gunners aimed sideways, their shots missed the low-flying torpedo bombers and peppered our own ships across the harbor. This was a disaster. I watched as a Japanese bomber fired at the gun turrets on the Raleigh, then roared right over Ford Island. The plane was so close I could see both the pilot and the tail gunner, the guy who sat with his back to the pilot, and shot a rear-mounted machine gun at anybody who tried to follow them. The Japanese pilot had on goggles and a brown leather bomber cap, and his white scarf fluttered out the side of the open cockpit window. The tail gunner saw me and Stanley looking at him, and I could swear he smiled and waved at us. "Holy cats, did you see that?" Stanley asked. I nodded. I was absolutely speechless. I wanted nothing more in that moment than to punch that guy in his grinning face. I'd never felt so much anger, so much hatred toward anybody in my entire life. I looked back across the water in time to see the gun crew on the Tangier score a hit on a Japanese plane. Stanley grabbed my shoulder, and I held my breath as the meatballs spiraled toward the water, leaving trails of gray smoke. Boom! The Japanese bomber crashed into the harbor, and Stanley and I cheered. Another Zero came streaking in, wing guns blazing. Stanley and I dropped to the ground as bullets ripped across the beach, just missing us. "Sure would be nice to be bulletproof like Superman now," said Stanley. That would have been nice, or be able to turn invisible like the Phantom Lady, or shrink and disappear like the Atom. "I think instead we need to make like the Flash and run," I said. And we took off into the chaos. Be more Koa. Stanley and I had crossed Ford 1,000 times. Getting to our houses from the beach was easy. All we had to do was run past a row of officer houses, slip through the hangars and buildings on the edge of the air station, and dash across the open stretch of asphalt runway. The runway where Japanese Zeros were now looping and diving and dropping bombs. "Maybe we should hide in one of the officer houses until the fighting's over," I said as we sprinted. A Japanese plane strafed the ships behind us in the water, and we both ducked. "Maybe that's not such a bad idea," Stanley said. We started to veer for the nearest house when... Kaboom! A bomb hit the house and knocked us to the ground. I landed with an oomph and curled up into a ball as pieces of the building landed all around us. Had there been any people inside? If there were, they had to be dead. Maybe hiding in a house isn't a great idea, Stanley said. I nodded, shaking as badly as Stanley was. I was scared out of my wits, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to hide, or hide it, because Stanley was just as scared as I was. Anybody would be. Which made me think that maybe, finally, Stanley might understand what it was like to be Frank McCoy. I looked up and saw a stand of koa trees between the officers' houses and the airfield's outbuildings. Koas were thick, gnarly trees with long, leafy branches that stretched out really wide. They could at least hide us from the Japanese planes. I stood and yanked Stanley to his feet, little bits of burning paper and debris from the exploded house floating all around us. We stayed low and ran until we reached the koas. Together, we hunkered down at the base of the biggest tree, catching our breaths as more Japanese planes buzzed overhead. "Stanley, I'm afraid," I confessed. "Me too," Stanley told me, his eyes wide. "No, yes, I'm afraid right now," I said. "But that's also why I didn't help you yesterday, when you were getting beat up by Arthur and Johnny." Stanley frowned, like this wasn't the time to bring it up. But if there was ever a time to talk about overwhelming, all-encompassing fear, it was when bombs were falling all around you. Koa meant brave in Hawaiian, and I took a deep breath and tried to channel some of the strength of the tree at my back as I finally confessed my secret. "I'm afraid of getting hurt," I told Stanley. "All the time, like I worry about getting hit on the head with a baseball or accidentally cutting myself with a kitchen knife." Stanley's frown became one of confusion. He opened his mouth to ask me a question, but I didn't let him. Not yet. I had to get this all out. "I worry about sharks," I told him, "and volcanoes, and plane crashes. I worry about the tires coming off our car when we're going around a curve. I worry about losing my fingers and toes to frostbite. I worry about losing my teeth or getting struck by lightning. I worry about alien invaders from Mars and burning myself on the stove and wearing flip-flops. I stay up late at night afraid I'll die in my sleep, or that my mom or dad or my sister will die. I lay awake scared that you'll die, Stanley." And now Brooks. I didn't finish that sentence. I couldn't. "I live in constant fear of getting hurt, Stanley. It's been a little better here in Hawaii, but not totally. I was too ashamed to tell you because I was scared that if you knew, you wouldn't want to be my friend anymore." "Wow," was all Stanley said. It was a lot to take in, I knew. Bullets suddenly chewed up the ground behind us. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Stanley and I covered our heads and shrank, but the big koa tree protected us. "You're really afraid of everything?" Stanley asked when the danger passed. "Pretty much. That's why I'm so good at holding my breath underwater," I explained. "Before I came here, when my dad told me we were moving to a tiny island way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I started taking advanced swimming lessons, just in case I accidentally got lost at sea and had to swim for shore." Stanley was quiet, and I glanced sideways at him to see what he was thinking. Was he going to tell me I was stupid? Was he going to hate me? Disapprove of me? Make fun of me? As scared as I was of the bullets and the bombs, the one thing I knew could kill me for sure was whatever Stanley said next. "Okay, there's just one thing I need to understand," Stanley said at last. "Why are you afraid of flip-flops?" Once bitten. My mouth hung open. After everything I'd been told, that was Stanley's question? Why I was afraid of flip-flops? "Okay, hear me out," I said. "First of all, no protection for your toes. You're just asking for a broken toe. But also, what if you're wearing flip-flops and a bear attacks you? Or somebody steals your backpack and you have to go after them? You can't run in flip-flops." Stanley nodded slowly, like he was listening to a toddler. I could tell I was losing him. It was all too weird, even for Stanley. My heart sank. "Were you always this way?" Stanley asked after a moment. "I was always a worrier," I said, "but I got worse after the incident." "The incident?" Stanley repeated. I took a deep breath. This is what had changed everything for me in Pensacola. Made me so afraid of getting hurt that I'd become the laughingstock of my school. But I'd come too far to not tell Stanley the whole story. When we lived in Florida, there was this big, mean dog chained up in front of one of the base houses, I told Stanley. Whenever I walked by him, he would jump and growl and bark and pull at his chain, trying to get at me. I was so afraid that big dog was going to break free from his chain and come for me, but everybody said it was never going to happen. And then one day, it did. Stanley's eyes went wide. The dog attacked you? Well, not at first, I said. I thought he was going to, but when he broke his chain, he ran straight across the yard and attacked this little yappy dog in a neighbor's yard. You should have seen him go at it. I thought the big dog was going to tear that little dog's throat out. What did you do? I ran over and tried to save the little dog. No way, Stanley said, impressed. I did, I said, and the big dog did this. I lifted up the tail of my shirt to show Stanley the thick, ropey scars on my stomach where the big dog had mauled me. Scars were hard for me to look at, even all these years later. An old familiar panic made my heart race, and it was like I could feel the awful stab and tear of the dog's teeth again. Stanley's eyes went wide, and he whistled and shook his head. But you saved the little dog, right? No, I said. That's the dumb thing. I mean, the little dog turned out all right. After the big dog tore me up, the two dogs didn't fight anymore. They just stood there right next to each other, looking at me like I was the biggest idiot in the world. I ended up in the hospital, and the wound really got infected, and it was all for nothing. And worse, it made me so scared of getting hurt again that I've been chicken about everything ever since. Stanley nodded sagely. Once bitten, twice shy, literally, he paused, then added, Hey, the run-in with the dog. That was your origin story. What? I said, taken aback. It made you who you are, like Batman, Stanley said. Or like how Billy Batson was given superpowers by the wizard Shazam because his parents died and his uncle stole his inheritance. Or how Green Arrow's sidekick, Speedy, learned how to hunt with a bow and arrow after his parents died in the plane crash that stranded him on that desert island. Stanley stopped and frowned. Wow, I never realized before how many superheroes were orphans, he said. Stanley's eyes went wide, and I knew that, like me, he was thinking about our parents again. We've been sitting here too long, he said. Let's go. I jumped up with Stanley, but I was too stunned by his words. Was the incident with the dog my origin story? I never thought of it that way. Getting bitten had made me the kind of person who ran away at the first sign of danger, who froze up and got his sister's boyfriend killed. But was that who I was going to be forever? Like a comic book character? Would I never change? An explosion up ahead rocked the earth, and Stanley and I stumbled and dropped to the ground. We crawled into the narrow space between two buildings on the edge of the airfield and huddled there with our backs to the wall. I'm not sure this was the safest route home, Stanley said. Crossing the airfield is dangerous because it's clearly a focus of the Japanese attack, I said. But Ford Island is so small that basically everything is a target. Going the other way would have exposed us to the Zeros for a lot longer. And we would have been right by the battleships, which are also clearly targets. So this route is the safest. Well, safer, I concluded. Wait, are you doing that all the time in your head? Stanley asked, weighing how dangerous this is versus that every moment of every day? I nodded. I was relieved that Stanley understood, but I was worried too. Usually when people figured out that part of me, they told me I was being foolish and I should just get it over with. Or they laughed at me. I take it back, said Stanley. Holding your breath isn't your superpower. Your superpower is risk assessment. I couldn't help but laugh. I never thought of what everybody else saw as a defect, as something to be proud of. But that was Stanley, always seeing the good in everything, and everybody. Come on, I think I see our dads, Stanley said. He jumped up and raced for the airfield, and I hurried after him. But the second we came out into the open, what we saw made us stop and stare. Duck and cover. The airfield looked nothing like the one we knew. The giant hangar where the flight crews had cookouts was a scorched, smoking skeleton. Planes Stanley and I played on sat crumpled and burning on the tarmac. Bomb craters and debris littered the runway where I'd watched my dad take off and land 100 times. I looked around for my dad, or for Stanley's, but couldn't see them. Navy pilots and flight crews ran this way and that, some of them trying to shoot at the passing Japanese planes with rifles, others throwing sand and water on the spreading flames. A Zero swooped down like a mosquito and took a bite out of the runway with his machine guns. Stanley and I dove for cover under a gray Navy service truck. My heart pounded as we hid, bullets zipping into the tarmac all around us. Fearing for their lives, our intrepid heroes take shelter from the pandemonium of the battle underneath a conveniently parked maintenance vehicle, Stanley said. Yeah, I said. Once again, his narrator voice didn't have the usual comic book bravado. The never-ending battle was taking its toll on both of us. You said you saw our dads. Where are they? I asked, searching the airfield as best I could from under the truck. I was desperate to know if my father was all right. There, Stanley said, pointing. Dad! Dad! He screamed, waving his arms out in front of him like a football referee calling an incomplete pass. I looked where he was waving and saw a team of Navy pilots and ground crew pushing an undamaged scout plane toward one of the hangars. My dad and Mr. Summers were with them. I wanted to yelp for joy. Dad was okay. Both our dads were. Dad! Over here! I yelled, waving my hands and hollering with Stanley. Stanley's dad finally heard us. He saw us under the truck, and his eyes went wide with terror. He yelled something I couldn't hear and broke away from the airplane, waving his arms as he ran toward us. When my dad saw what was happening, he started running and yelling and pointing at us too. Well, that's not the reaction I was expecting, Stanley said. Me neither, I said. Were they angry at us for being here? I felt something wet underneath me, and I shifted awkwardly to see what it was. It was hard to make out in the shade of the truck, but the liquid had a shiny, multicolored surface. I touched a finger to the stuff and brought it to my nose, and goosebumps crawled up and down my arms. I searched the bottom of the truck, looking for a leak, but there wasn't one, which could only mean one thing. Oh, Stanley, I said, I think we've made a very bad risk assessment. What? How? He asked. I slid around the spill to the edge of the truck. I peeked up at the side, and suddenly I understood why our dads were running toward us in such a panic. Stenciled on the side of the truck was a single word: gasoline. Grounded. Gas tanker! I cried, pulling on Stanley's arm. We're hiding under a gas tanker! We scrambled out from under the truck as fast as we could. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the other ground crew and pilots running for a makeshift machine gun nest, ringed with sandbags. Our dads were still running toward us, but now my dad was pointing frantically at something in the sky. He was yelling too, but I couldn't hear him over the shrill whine that was getting louder and louder every second. I looked up and saw a Japanese plane diving straight at the gasoline truck. Straight at us. Seconds seemed to turn into minutes as a large round object detached from the plane. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was watch in stunned horror as the plane pulled up and away, but the object continued to fall, getting bigger and bigger and... Bomb! I yelled, finally coming to my senses. Stanley, run! The second Stanley saw the falling bomb, he took off at a dead sprint like lashed lightning. Time was suddenly measured in thundering heartbeats, in the pounding of my feet on the hard, hot tarmac. The racket from the battle faded away, replaced in my head with the static between radio stations. My entire being became focused on getting as far away from the tanker as fast as I could. Getting to our dads, who were racing just as hard toward us. Run! Run! I heard my dad cry as we got closer. Go! Go! I yelled when we were almost on top of them. We couldn't stop here. Our dads screeched to a halt as we passed them, and then they turned and joined me and Stanley as we raced for the ring of sandbags. All the other Navy men had already beaten us there except for one member of the ground crew, who we quickly left in the dust. Like our dads, he had been expecting a leisurely day off and was wearing an aloha shirt and shorts. But unlike our dads, he was wearing flip-flops. Come on, run! The others called out to us, and the strangling crewmen. I leaped over the sandbags with Stanley and our dads just as... Kaboom! The gas tanker exploded in an earth-shaking fireball that made my insides jiggle. The blast was deafeningly loud, and I threw my hands over my ears as metal pieces of the truck went whistling in all directions. Over the roar of a blazing fire, I heard the smash of wood and the creak and crash of steel. When the last of the shrapnel had fallen, I peeked up from behind the sandbag walls. Bomb had struck the gas tanker dead on, blowing it sky high. The explosion had wrecked a plane and another truck. It had also taken out a corner of the hangar, which had collapsed into a pile of broken timbers and twisted girders. Just about the only thing the tanker hadn't destroyed was the plane Dad and the others had been pushing toward the hangar. "Holy cats, we were just hiding under there," Stanley said, staring at the burning crater where the gas tanker had once been. "Woody!" one of the Navy guys cried. He and a couple of others hopped over the sandbags and ran to the man who'd been wearing flip-flops. Woody hadn't made it to safety in time. He wasn't dead, but he was a bloody mess. His arms and legs were all torn up, and I could see the back of his Aloha shirt burned into his skin. The wounded man's buddies picked him up and hauled him toward a dispensary where he could get treated. "Okay, wow," Stanley said, sliding down with his back to the sandbags. "I get the thing about flip-flops." "What are you boys doing here?" Stanley's dad asked. He and my dad looked furious as they turned on Stanley and me. "Usually I can count on you to be somewhere safe, Frank," my dad said. He didn't mean it that way, but his words still stung. I was a chicken, and everybody knew it. "We're just trying to get home," Stanley told them. "Dad, the Utah capsized, and the Riley sunk," I said. "Half the ships in the East Lock are on fire," Stanley added. Our dads looked at each other in horror, and Stanley's dad cursed. Apparently they hadn't known. I took a deep breath, ready to tell Dad about Brooks, when Stanley cut in. "Why aren't there any American planes fighting back?" he asked. Mr. Summers huffed, and my dad scowled. "We asked for permission to get the birds in the air," Mr. Summers said, "but our commanding officer, who's not even here," my dad added, "ordered us to hide the planes in the hangars," Mr. Summers finished. "Most of the planes aren't flight ready anyway. Headquarters was more worried about local sabotage than a bombing attack or invasion, so they had us disarm the planes and park them together out in the open so we'd see if anybody was messing with them." "Idiots," my dad said. "It just made the planes easy targets, and it's keeping us from hitting back." And right there, that was the fundamental difference between me and my dad. To me, headquarters' idea made a lot of sense. The newspapers were full of warnings about saboteurs and spies, and 1/3 of Hawaii's population was Japanese. Who knew how many of them were enemy targets, enemy agents? I would have played it safe and left the airplanes out on the runway too. Besides, the Japanese army actually attacking had been 1,000,000 to 1 odds. Wasn't that what everybody had always said? "Well, seeing as there's no hangar to park what's left of the planes," Mr. Summers said to my dad, "what say we forget orders and get at least one of these birds in the air?" "Now you're talking," Dad said. "I thought you didn't want to fight," I said to Mr. Summers, remembering what he'd said in the backyard yesterday. "That was before we were attacked," Mr. Summers said. "We've got to go to war now, don't we? We can't take a punch and not fight back." Stanley's dad turned to his crew. "All right, let's get that plane prepped and ready to take off ASAP," he cried. And there were cheers as the ground crew hopped over the sandbags and ran to prep the airplane for takeoff. Stanley got up to go with them, but his dad pulled him back. No, Mr. Summers said. "But Dad, we can help," Stanley said. "Every Navy pilot and mechanic on the island is here, whether they were on duty or not," Mr. Summers said. "We have plenty of people to do this, guys who joined up and are trained for this." My dad put a hand on my shoulder. "I know I'm always telling you to take more chances, Frank, but you already have just coming here. The rest isn't for you boys to do." Stanley was downcast, but I was secretly relieved. Every second we spent at the airfield was another second we could be hurt or killed. There was a difference between being brave and being stupid. This was our dad's jobs, not ours. "You boys get to the dungeon under Admiral Bellinger's house," Dad told me. "That's where your mom and your sister went as I was leaving for the airfield. You'll be safe there." Safer, I thought, but I didn't say it. Dad pulled me into a hug, which he hadn't done since I was a kid. I was surprised, but I hugged him back, hard. "Remember what President Roosevelt said? The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he whispered into my ear. "You're braver than you think, Frank McCoy." His words startled me more than the hug. Dad had always told me to be brave. Never that I was brave. I had just felt relieved that we were being sent away from the danger. Now he was telling me that I was braver than I thought. What did Dad see in me that I didn't see in myself? Dad sat back, his hands on my shoulders. "Tell your mom and Ginny that I love them, and I'll see them when this is all over," he said, then climbed over the sandbags to run to the plane. Dad's words felt final somehow, and I choked down tears. He was getting ready to climb into a plane and fly up alone into the swarm of Japanese planes. There were 100 different ways he could die. 1,000. He could be shot down by a Zero, or get hit by our own anti-aircraft fire. He could crash on the mainland, or be killed in his cockpit and spin down into the sea, or parachute out and be shot in the sky, or survive a water landing only to be eaten by sharks or giant eels, or... Mr. Summers squeezed my arm. "Don't worry about your dad," he said, as if he could read my mind. "He's a great pilot. He's safer up there than we are down here." I wasn't sure about that, but there was nothing I could do about it now. "And the two of you will be much safer in the dungeon," Mr. Summers told us. "But Stanley, I need you to go by your house first. Make sure your mom's not there. I told her to get to the dungeon, but she wouldn't leave the house, not right away." "What?" Stanley said. "Why not?" "I don't know. She was in a state. Said there was something she had to do first," Stanley's dad told him, worry written all over his face. "I hated to leave her, but they were calling everybody to the airfield on the radio, and I had to run. I know your mom can take care of herself, but just make sure she's out of there and safe in the dungeon, will you?" Stanley was confused. I was too. But our houses were on the way to the dungeon. We could quickly check in to make sure Mrs. Summers was gone. Stanley's dad put his hands on his son's shoulders and looked him straight in the eye. "You're going to have to look out for your mom now, Stanley. You hear me?" Stanley pulled away, frowning. "What are you saying, Dad? You're not going to die, are you?" No, Stanley's dad told him. "I'm coming home when all this is done. I promise. Things are going to be different now," he said. "For your mom and for you." Stanley still didn't seem to understand, and neither did I. But there wasn't time to say anything more. Zeros were strafing and bombing the airfield, and there were American planes to get flying. "Go," Mr. Summers said. He gave Stanley a kiss on the head and pushed us toward home. "And be careful," he said. You didn't have to worry about me. Careful was my middle name. But I could see from the frown on Stanley's face that his father had planted a seed of doubt in him that was suddenly making him question everything. "Come on," I said, grabbing Stanley's arm. I wanted to be in the dungeon 20 minutes ago, and if we were going to make a pit stop at Stanley's house, we had to be fast. I only looked back once, in time to see my dad's plane climbing straight up into the smoke-black sky. I should have cheered, but as he roared off into the battle, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever see him alive again.